from the junior high student to the college grad, from the stay-at-home mom to the small business owner, from the new believer to the church leader, we all have questions. Where do you turn when there's no one to listen or no one to give answers? Who do you talk to? How do you overcome the stress and anxiety of trying to figure things out on your own? Well, for all of life's questions, we have the Bible, God's Word. And for the last several weeks, we have been going through this series of tough issues, trying to find biblical answers to life's hard questions. And so far, we've explored some tough topics like abortion, depression, and most recently, pornography. Last Sunday we discovered that the Bible has a lot to say about the evils and the effects of pornography, but it also tells us that God will provide a way of escape for anyone struggling with that particular sin. And this Sunday we're going to dive into another tough issue that affects far too many of us today, and that is the issue of divorce. Relationships can be messy. Marriage in particular can baffle even the best of us. Marriage is kind of like twirling a baton or eating with chopsticks or turning handsprings. It looks easy until you try it. There's a speaker at a women's club lecturing on marriage, and she asked her audience, how many of you want to mother your husband? And there was one lady in the back who put her hand high in the air, and the speaker had this confused look, and she's like, you want to mother your husband, really? And the lady in the back said, oh, mother. I'm sorry, I thought you said smother. When asked how he gets along with his in-laws, one husband said, actually, my mother-in-law and I have a lot in common. We both wish that my wife had married someone else. True. That's not me. The truth is, marriage is never easy. And most of us had no idea what we were getting into when we got married. We've all probably got questions about marriage and divorce. And in fact, few subjects in the church have caused as much contention and controversy as the topic of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Thankfully, the Bible offers a carefully reasoned discussion of the subject in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, in which the Apostle Paul describes three types of marriages. Successful marriages where both partners are happy and holy, struggling marriages like the kind that typically end in divorce, and second marriages where a divorcee takes another shot at a new relationship. And I want to look at each of these briefly. Before considering divorce, Christians ought to listen carefully to Paul's instructions for successful marriages. Successful marriages. Valerie L. Bunyan, writing in Reader's Digest, once told the story of shortly after their youngest child had graduated and left for college. She and her husband were sitting on the couch, and he laid back and put his head in her lap. She took off his glasses and said, honey, without your glasses, you look like the same handsome young man I married all those years ago. And he looked back up at her with a grin and said, you know what? Without my glasses, you don't look half bad either. I guess you could call that a successful marriage, but this is how the Apostle Paul describes and defines it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning verse 1, he says, because there is so much sexual immorality, and that's that word porneia that we talked about last week, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. The husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time, so that you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, this is the second chapter in a row where Paul speaks in detail about sex. In chapter 6, Paul described the sexual sins of the Corinthians, including incest and prostitution, adultery, homosexuality, and sexual immorality in general, including pornography. But here, Paul places sex on the pedestal of marriage, and he honors it. In fact, this passage identifies two keys to a successful marriage. The first is sexual intimacy. Now, some sophisticates would like to deny it, but sex is a vitally important part of a successful marriage. Willard Harley, in his best-selling book, His Needs, Her Needs, identifies sexual fulfillment as a man's number one emotional need. And more than that, sex was created by God as a sort of marital glue. It's strange that a lot of young people grow up in the church thinking that God is kind of down on sex, like God in the Bible are anti-sex, but nothing could be further from the truth. Sex is a vitally important part of God's design for marriage. In fact, the very first command that God gave to Adam and Eve involved having sex. He told them to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, get busy making babies. There's an emotional, physical, and spiritual bond created by sex that the Bible refers to as one flesh. That's the term that it uses repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. And when we allow sex to kind of fall by the wayside in our relationship, either because we're busy or tired or stressed or just not connecting the way that we should, that bond is weakened. And the Bible encourages us in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, marriage should be honored by all and the marriage bed kept pure. And just to follow up on last week's message, if you weren't here, I talked about pornography last week and how addictive that can be. And for anyone that struggles with the sin of pornography, regular, consistent, mutually loving sex is absolutely essential in breaking that cycle. So if you've got a spouse, or if you or your spouse struggles with pornography, this is one of the most important things that you can do to avoid that temptation. You're going to be much stronger and able to resist that temptation if you have a good, healthy sex life with your spouse. That's exactly what Paul's talking about when he says, come together often so that Satan won't be able to tempt you. Moreover, according to research conducted by Duke University in 2017, sex releases a chemical, a hormone called oxytocin. And this wasn't a new discovery or anything. It's sometimes referred to as the love hormone because it encourages or triggers emotional bonding. But it also triggers spirituality, especially in men. Oxytocin sparks positive emotions such as awe, gratitude, hope, inspiration, love, and serenity. It's what causes that euphoric feeling that you get after great sex. That's where that comes from. It's just this hormone that surges through your body and just makes you feel wonderful, like everything is right in the world. Well, according to research, men are much more likely to say that faith and spirituality are an important part of their life after a healthy dose of oxytocin. The effects of which can last up to several days. But in short, the research indicates that a good sex life leads to increased spirituality and faith, which is important because sexual intimacy is just one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is spiritual intimacy. Again, looking back at verse 5, Paul said, do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Now, I would probably be shocked if anyone raised their hand when I asked the question, have you denied yourself sex so that you can pray more? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but if you did, I'd be surprised. Because I don't think that's something that we do very often, but prayer is absolutely essential to a successful marriage. Just as sex creates a physical and emotional bond, prayer creates this spiritual bond. And prayer not only opens up communication between you and God, but it strengthens the bond of marriage. Studies have shown that the age-old adage, couples that pray together stay together, is really true. A Gallup study of 657 married couples, which was conducted for Psychology Today, showed that couples that pray together daily had a significantly lower divorce rate than those who did not pray together. Praying together as a couple encourages unity and promotes intimacy, and most importantly, it invites God into your relationship. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other factors that come into play in any relationship, but generally speaking, sexual intimacy plus spiritual intimacy is going to equal a successful marriage. Now, sadly, not every marriage is successful, which is why Paul goes on to describe struggling marriages. Divorced couples in Albuquerque, New Mexico can now take advantage of a new business called Freedom Rings, jewelry for the divorced. The founder of the company, who is a divorcee and jeweler, I can't even say that word, person who makes jewelry, founded this company which makes custom jewelry out of wedding rings. And each customer at Freedom Rings pays a fee, and then the ring smashing ceremony begins. The MC will come out and he will say, we now release any remaining ties to your past by transforming your ring into a token of your new beginning. Repeat after me, with this swing, let freedom ring. And she then uses a 4-pound sledgehammer to whack her emblem of love and fidelity into a shapeless piece of metal. And the fact that women are pounding their wedding rings into pendants and men are grinding theirs into golf ball markers doesn't really surprise me. Bitter divorcees and struggling marriages are nothing new, which is why Paul had this to say to believers in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says, I pass this command along, not really I, but the Lord. When he says that he's talking about, he's kind of repeating something that Jesus said in the Gospels. A wife shouldn't leave her husband. If she does, she should stay single or make up with her husband. And likewise, a husband should not divorce his wife. Now I, not the Lord, say to the rest of you, if any Christian man is married to a woman who is an unbeliever, and she's willing to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any Christian woman is married to a man who is an unbeliever and he's willing to live with her, she should not divorce her husband. But if the unbelieving partner leaves, let them go. Under these circumstances, a Christian man or woman is not bound by a marriage vow. God has called you to live in peace. In short, Paul's instructions to Christians in struggling marriage is simply stay together. Don't get divorced. Don't look for the door. Just hang in there. And if you do get divorced, he says, don't jump into another relationship, because then you'll forfeit any possibility of reconciliation. Christians ought to do everything they can to hold their marriage together. Now, unfortunately, it's not always up to us. There are going to be times when the person that you love leaves, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And Paul recognizes that. He says in those cases, you're not bound by your vow. Now, some people read this and think that's not really fair. You don't know my husband, or you don't know my wife. She can be terrible, or he can be such a jerk, and I want to get out of this relationship. And they might wonder, well, aren't there any biblical reasons to get divorced? And the answer is yes, there are. In addition to abandonment, which is what Paul's describing here when one of them just up and leaves. The Bible also allows for divorce in cases of neglect and sexual neglect and adultery. And you can read about those in Deuteronomy 24 and Exodus 21 and Matthew 19. Paul just doesn't get into any of that stuff because he wants to stress the importance of hanging in there and not giving up on your marriage. Jesus did the same thing in Matthew 19, verse 6, when he said, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Just because your marriage is struggling doesn't mean that it's beyond saving. We've all heard sad statistics about marriage, but in her book, The Good News About Marriage, Shaunti Feldman reveals some surprisingly positive statistics. Perhaps most surprising is that half of all marriages are not ending in divorce. According to the Census Bureau, 72% of those who have ever been married are still married to their first spouse. 72%. And of the 28% that remain, that includes widows and widowers. So the reason that the statistics sometimes look like so many marriages are ending in divorce is that you've got some people, like the majority, 72%, stay married for a lifetime, but then you've got a small number of people who are like serial wedding people. I don't know what the right term for that is. Serial divorcees who will, they'll get divorced and remarried and divorced and remarried and divorced and remarried, and it kind of drives those statistics up. And not only is the divorce rate in general much lower than what we've been led to believe, but the divorce rate among churchgoers is 27% lower than it is among unchurched people. And Feldman also reveals that 93% of married people say they would marry the same person again if they had to do it all over. I don't know about the other 7%, but 93% is pretty good. And 97% expect to stay married for the rest of their life. That's good news for married couples. Most marriages really do last a lifetime just as God intended for them to. And if you're struggling in your marriage, rekindling the romance and restoring your relationship is not impossible. Psychologist Dr. W. Crane tells a story of a woman who came to him seeking counsel, and she told him how bitter she felt toward her husband. She was angry. He had hurt her, and she wanted to hurt him back. And so she was going to file for divorce. And her counselor, Dr. Crane, encouraged her. He said, if you really want to hurt your husband, I would advise you not to file for divorce right away. Instead, start showering him with compliments. Lavish your love on him. Treat him the way that you did when you first got married. And then when you've become indispensable to him, when he thinks you are madly in love with him, then file for divorce. He won't see it coming, and it will hurt more than anything. And so several months later, the wife returned to report that she had been following the psychologist's advice, and all was going well. And so he said, good, does that mean that you're ready to file for divorce? And she said, divorce? Heavens no. I love my husband now more than ever. I don't know if Paul would have used that sort of reverse psychology, but I think he would have liked Dr. Crane's results. And it's often true that the way we treat our spouse is going to determine how they treat us. That's why Jesus told us to treat others the way we want to be treated. Because generally speaking, when you treat others a certain way, they're going to want to treat you that way too. If you're in a struggling marriage, I want to encourage you to hang in there and start applying the principles of a successful marriage. But finally, Paul also discusses this third type of marriage, second marriages. Sadly, Christians who have remarried and divorced after a divorce are often treated like second-class Christians in the church. And this isn't something that I've seen or really experienced since coming here to the Grove. And so maybe it's not even something that you're familiar with, but across the broad church experience, there are lots of churches and denominations that teach that someone who has been divorced doesn't even have the right or privilege to get married again. And if you do get married again, well then God doesn't really see that as a marriage, and you're just living in adultery, and so you're living in sin for the rest of your life. And that kind of baggage has been saddled on a lot of different people. When I was early in my ministry, I preached for a small church in Lake Station, Indiana. And it was a small church, literally 15 people. 12 of them were women. I think there was 3 guys that went there. 2 of them were the elders of the church. And on one particular Sunday, those 2 guys were both out of town. And they were usually the ones who would say prayers and lead singing while I did the preaching. And so I was like, I don't know. I started asking people who might help out. And I asked the one other guy in the church if he'd be interested in saying a prayer. And he was usually pretty quiet and reserved, but he got really excited when I asked him to say a prayer. And I thought that was a little weird. I'm like, most people say, no, Scott, I don't want to do that. A few minutes went by. I was doing other things. And then right before service start, he came up to me and said, I should probably tell you that I've been divorced and remarried. Shelley is my second wife. And I looked at him kind of funny, like, why are you telling me this? And he explained that the elders, the other two guys in the church, had told him that because he had been divorced and remarried, he wasn't allowed to participate in leading service in any way. He still prayed that day, but I caught a lot of flack for it the next Sunday. This sort of thing is much more common than you might realize. I got a letter a few years back from a guy named Steve in Jerseyville, Texas. He wrote, "Dear Mr. Bales, I'm a divorced man looking to remarry, and I came across your article on divorce and remarriage. I'm part of the Church of Christ, and all too often I feel like I've been hit over the head with the Bible on how I'm not allowed to remarry because I'm living in adultery. The situation in our church is so severe that men are instructing and persuading women in the church not to date me or even spend time with me for fear of them falling into adultery with me. For a church that promotes love, fellowship, and unity, I often feel the complete opposite when it comes to the topics of divorce and remarriage." And sadly, there's hundreds, even thousands more people like Steve all over the country. And thankfully, Paul addresses this issue as plainly as possible. First, he says in verses 8 and 9, "To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Now, let me explain a little bit here. The Greeks didn't have a word for divorcee. That just wasn't part of their vocabulary. But the word that Paul uses here, unmarried, agamos in Greek, is unique to him. In fact, it only appears 4 times in the entire Bible, and all 4 of them are right here in this passage. The Greek prefix a, or un in English, typically means to undo something that was previously done. So like to untie or uncover something. And in this verse, the unmarried are compared to widows. It's set alongside widows, but distinct from widows. So it's someone who's not married, but their spouse has not died. In verse 34, the unmarried are set alongside virgins, is the Greek term. Singles is the most English translations. So unmarried is set next to people who have never been married before, and yet different from it. And then in verse 10, a woman who has left her husband is specifically identified as unmarried in that verse. So evidently, this term unmarried was Paul's own word for divorcees. And so here, Paul encourages these divorced Christians to stay single, but if they can't control their sexual desires, then they should marry, he says. And in case that wasn't clear enough for the Corinthians or for us, Paul states again in verse 26 and 27, he says, "Because of the present crisis, I believe it is good for people to remain as they are. Do you have a wife? Don't seek a divorce. Are you divorced from your wife? Don't look for another one. But if you do get married, you have not sinned." By the way, all throughout this passage, Paul is constantly encouraging people to stay single. It's not because Paul hates marriage or anything like that. It's this present crisis that he refers to here. The church all over the Roman Empire was experiencing persecution very severely. And so when there's a chance that Roman soldiers are going to show up at your door and drag you off to prison or feed you to lions or something worse, it's not really the ideal time to start a family. And so that's why he's discouraging people from getting married at this particular time. But he says as clearly as possible, if you have been divorced, it's not a sin to get married again. And so anyone who's been through a divorce knows how painful and difficult that can be. Studies have shown that of the various stressors people typically experience in life, moving, losing a job, getting married, getting divorced, is right at the top of the list. It's a very painful and traumatic experience for most people, and it leaves scars, especially when you're the one who didn't want that divorce in the first place. But Paul wants us to understand that there's no spiritual punishment that follows a failed marriage. You're not expected to remain single the rest of your life because you couldn't get it right the first time. There is one caveat, though. Paul specifically instructs widows in verse 39. He says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, then she's free to marry anyone she wishes, but only if he loves the Lord. I think that this stipulation applies to singles and divorcees as much as it does to widows. Unfortunately, it's often ignored, and that causes later problems in the relationship. If you've been through a divorce, or even if you're single and hoping to get married sometime down the road, look for someone who loves the Lord. Don't settle for anything less than that. Whether you are in a successful marriage, a struggling marriage, or a second marriage, God's matchless grace is always available to you. It can fix a broken marriage, or it can make a good marriage even better. If you've been through a painful divorce, there is hope and healing in Jesus and in His church. Next week, we'll continue our series of tough issues by wrestling with the hot-button issue of racism. In the meantime, if you're married, whether it's successful, struggling, or a second marriage, I want to invite you to lay your relationship at the feet of Jesus. Invite God into your marriage and experience the difference that can make. And if I can help you with that, please just come forward and take a seat in the front pew, or pull me aside after church, or call me at home anytime throughout the week. My phone number's in the back of the bulletin if you don't already have it. In the meantime, let's stand and sing together, church.